Ask almost anyone to name a Victorian serial killer, and they'll say the same word within seconds. Ripper. It's the single most famous unsolved murder case in the world, an entire mythology built around one killer stalking the fog-choked streets of Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888. Books, films, walking tours, entire academic careers have been built around those few months and those few names. What almost nobody mentions, and what most documentaries never even get to, is that London, at that exact same time, had two serial killers operating within a few miles of each other. Two. Not one legendary monster haunting a single terrified neighborhood, but two entirely separate men dismembering women in the same city, during the same years, and in some cases, quite possibly on the very same streets. And the second one was arguably more skilled, more disciplined, and more successful at evading capture than the man whose name became famous. He didn't leave bodies in alleyways for horrified witnesses to stumble across. He took his victims apart with what one examining doctor would later describe as clear anatomical knowledge, wrapped the pieces separately, and distributed them deliberately along miles of London's waterways and construction sites as though scattering a puzzle he knew the police would never fully assemble. Today, he's barely a footnote, a case file gathering dust in the same archives that made his contemporary immortal. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why one Victorian killer became the most famous name in criminal history, while another, arguably just as prolific and considerably more careful, simply vanished into the footnotes of the same case files. And what that says about how true crime, even today, decides which victims and which killers get remembered. To understand how completely this second killer slipped through the cracks of history, you first have to understand just how little London's police had to work with when these murders began. This was a city without fingerprinting, without a national missing persons database, without reliable crime scene photography, policed by a force that was, by the 1880s, already straining under the weight of a rapidly expanding, desperately poor East End. It was also a city where the women most likely to become victims, those working the streets, living in overcrowded lodging houses, moving frequently between addresses to stay ahead of debt or danger, were often the hardest of anyone in London to track, to report missing, or to formally identify even when their remains were eventually found. Poverty didn't just make these women vulnerable to violence. It made them, in the eyes of an overwhelmed Victorian bureaucracy, disturbingly easy to lose track of entirely. Long before Jack the Ripper ever picked up a knife, the River Thames had already started giving up secrets that London's police had no framework for understanding at all. On the morning of September 5, 1873, a police patrol rowing near Battersea found the left portion of a woman's torso lodged in the mud along the riverbank. Over the following days, more fragments surfaced nearby, carried by the tide or dislodged from wherever they had first been hidden. No head, no means of identification, just careful, deliberate dismemberment, and a body that had been taken apart by someone who clearly did not want her ever to be identified. The investigation that followed had almost nowhere to go. Without a face, without a name, without so much as a distinguishing scar that could be circulated and recognized, Victorian detective work simply stalled, and the case slipped quietly into the growing pile of London's unsolved dead. Less than a year later, in June of 1874, dock workers near Putney pulled another female torso from the river. The limbs removed with the same unsettling precision, wrapped this time in fabric investigators recognized as material typically used by surgeons, the kind of detail that should have set off alarm bells connecting it to the Battersea case, and yet, in a city without any centralized way to cross-reference crimes across different police divisions, largely didn't. London in the 1870s had almost no forensic tools to work with. No fingerprinting. No photography reliable enough to circulate widely. A murder investigation without a face or a name to attach to it very often went absolutely nowhere, and both of these cases did exactly that, fading into unsolved silence for over a decade, filed away separately, treated as isolated horrors rather than what they may well have actually been, the opening chapters of something far larger. Then, in October of 1884, a full decade later, workers digging at a construction site on Tottenham Court Road unearthed a woman's skull, still bearing traces of flesh, alongside a thigh bone that had clearly been exposed to the elements for weeks before being buried. That same day, an arm believed to belong to the same victim was found wrapped in a parcel and thrown over the railings into a nearby garden. It bore a small tattoo, a heart pierced by an arrow, the kind of marking common among women working the streets of Victorian London at the time. One of the only human details investigators would ever recover about her, a fragment of identity attached to a woman whose name history would never learn. She was never identified. Neither was her killer. And once again, the case simply closed itself through inaction. Another name that was never assigned to another body that was never fully found. By the time the 1880s came to a close, these individual, decades-apart discoveries would start to look less like isolated incidents and more like chapters of the exact same terrible story. A pattern that only became visible in hindsight, long after any realistic chance of catching the person responsible for the earliest cases had already slipped away. In May of 1887, a torso wrapped tightly in a bundle was pulled from the Thames near Rainham. Over the following weeks, additional body parts surfaced along the riverbank, piece by piece, almost as though the river itself were slowly returning a puzzle to searching hands, until investigators had recovered nearly the entire body. Nearly, the head and neck were never found, and without them, identifying the victim proved, once again, completely impossible. This case would later be recognized as the true beginning of what investigators eventually started calling, with grim simplicity, the Thames Mysteries, the official start of a series that would stretch on for 2 more harrowing years. It's worth pausing here on exactly what made these murders so different from the crime already gripping London's imagination at the time. Because the contrast is, frankly, the entire reason this case deserves to be remembered rather than forgotten. This killer wasn't frenzied. He wasn't sloppy. Whoever was doing this worked with what one assistant police surgeon, examining the remains years later, would describe as genuine anatomical skill. Clean, deliberate cuts, careful separation of the body into transportable sections, and an evident understanding of exactly how to dispose of each piece in a way that would make reassembly and identification as difficult as humanly possible. This wasn't rage translated into violence. This looked, disturbingly, like a process, refined and repeated, executed by someone who had clearly done this before and fully intended to do it again. A little over a year later, in the late summer and early autumn of 1888, the case took a turn that would end up permanently overshadowed by history's timing. A coincidence so precise it feels almost engineered in retrospect. On September 11th, the arm of a woman was pulled from the Thames near Pimlico. A second arm was recovered over 2 weeks later alongside a road in Lambeth. And on October 2nd, a headless torso was uncovered at a construction site in Whitehall, at the exact location where a brand new building was going up. That building would become the new headquarters of London's Metropolitan Police. Scotland Yard itself was quite literally being built directly on top of evidence from an active unsolved murder. a detail so darkly ironic that if it appeared in a piece of fiction, most readers would assume the writer had made it up. This case became known as the Whitehall Mystery, and its timing is almost impossible to overstate. It unfolded during the exact same weeks that a killer in Whitechapel, only a few miles away, was carrying out the murders that would come to define an entire era of criminal history. In fact, the body of Mary Ann Nichols, the first victim widely attributed to Jack the Ripper, had been discovered barely a month before the Whitehall torso surfaced. London's newspapers and London's police were suddenly dealing with two entirely separate patterns of mutilated female victims, discovered within walking distance of each other, in the same terrified city, at the same terrified moment in time. One newspaper of the period would go on to describe the summer as nothing short of an epidemic of murder, a phrase that, reading it now, feels almost like an understatement. Consider, for a moment, what that actually meant for the detectives working these cases. The same overstretched police divisions, the same handful of assistant surgeons conducting examinations, the same newspapers competing for the most horrifying possible headline, all trying to track two entirely different killers at once, using investigative tools that were, by any modern standard, barely functional. Tips meant for one case were sometimes filed under the other. Witnesses describing one series of events were occasionally assumed to be talking about the other entirely. The sheer administrative chaos of running two unrelated serial murder investigations simultaneously, in an era before radios, before centralized records, before anything resembling modern forensic science, may be one of the most underappreciated details in the entire history of Victorian policing. For over a century since, one question has quietly divided historians, investigators, and true crime researchers alike. Were these actually the same killer? On the surface, the overlap seems almost too neat to be coincidence. Both series targeted vulnerable women, largely believed to be sex workers, in the same general area of London during the exact same years. Both killers demonstrated at least some anatomical familiarity with the human body. Both went uncaught, despite enormous public pressure and a manhunt unlike almost anything London had seen before. But the deeper investigators looked, the more the two patterns seemed to pull apart from each other entirely. Jack the Ripper's victims were left exactly where they were killed, mutilated in a frenzied, exposed, almost theatrical manner, with specific and consistent damage to their abdomens, apparently killed quickly and mutilated where they fell. The Thames victims were never left where they died at all. They were transported, carefully dismembered, and distributed piece by piece across the city, with what looked less like rage and more like an unsettling kind of patience. A killer who had clearly planned not just the act itself, but everything that came afterward. The clearest distinction came down to a single, specific detail investigators kept returning to, one that would ultimately shape the entire official conclusion of the case. Jack the Ripper's victims consistently showed mutilation to their reproductive organs, damage widely believed to be the entire motive behind his killings. The driving psychological signature investigators would spend the next century trying to understand. The Thames victims, almost without exception, did not. Whoever was dismembering these women was doing so for a different reason entirely. One that police in 1888, working without modern forensic psychology, without any real concept of what we would now call an offender profile, could barely begin to articulate, let alone investigate properly. And then, in September of 1889, the case did something that made the overlap even harder to dismiss. Right at the moment when public attention had begun, cautiously, to move on. A police constable discovered the headless, legless torso of an unidentified woman under a railway arch on Pinchin Street in Whitechapel, in the same neighborhood, on the same streets, where the Ripper murders had unfolded barely a year earlier. Her abdomen bore mutilation strikingly reminiscent of his signature style. Her genitals, notably, did not. It was, for investigators at the time, the most confusing piece of evidence the entire series had produced. Was this a message? Was this a coincidence? Was this the same man, deliberately mimicking his own earlier work in the exact place that had made him famous, perhaps even taunting a police force that had failed to catch him the first time? Or was it simply proof that two entirely different killers had, by grim coincidence, chosen the same hunting ground, drawn to the same vulnerable population in the same overlooked corner of the city, for two entirely unrelated reasons? Scotland Yard, after extensive investigation, officially concluded the two-case series were unrelated, the work of two separate men operating with two entirely different motives, in the same city, at the same time, a conclusion that remains the majority position among historians today, even as debate over it continues in true crime circles more than a century later. Some researchers have argued, over the decades, that the methodical, almost surgical nature of the Thames killings actually points towards someone with medical or anatomical training, a theory that has occasionally been used to bolster certain Ripper suspect theories involving doctors, though no solid evidence has ever connected any single named suspect definitively to both series of murders. Others maintain that the differences in method are simply too significant to ignore, and that treating the cases as separate is not just the official conclusion, but very likely the correct one. Whichever conclusion is correct, one basic, uncomfortable fact remains, and it's the fact that, more than anything else, this video wants to sit with. At least 4 women, quite possibly more once you include the earlier, less documented cases from the 1870s and mid-80s, were murdered, dismembered, and scattered across London's waterways over more than 15 years, and not one of them was ever definitively identified. Not one killer was ever named, charged, or brought before a court. 4 women, at minimum, who had names, families, entire lives before they became case numbers in a file nobody remembers, erased twice over, once by whoever killed them, and a second time by history's decision to look somewhere else. Investigators at the time faced obstacles that seem almost unthinkable by modern standards. No fingerprinting existed. No database could cross-reference missing persons across different police divisions, meaning a woman reported missing in one part of London might never be connected to remains discovered in another. Photography of remains was rudimentary at best, and examining doctors like Charles Hebert, tasked with drawing conclusions from body parts that had often spent weeks submerged in the Thames, openly admitted in their case, reports how difficult it was to determine even the most basic facts about a victim: her age, her height, sometimes even her gender, once decomposition and the river itself had done their work. Modern forensic science, DNA analysis, isotope testing, facial reconstruction, all of it arrived roughly a century too late to offer these women anything close to justice. So why does almost nobody know this story? Why does one Victorian killer's name echo through more than a century of books, films, and documentaries, while another, by some measures more prolific and unquestionably more methodical, simply disappeared into the footnotes of true crime history? Perhaps it comes down to something as simple as theater. Jack the Ripper left his victims in the open, in the exact neighborhood where the crimes occurred, generating immediate horror and immediate headlines. A killer whose crimes were, almost by design, built for public consumption. The Thames killer scattered his evidence deliberately across an entire city, denying the press the single shocking crime scene image that turns a murder into a legend. One killer performed for an audience. The other one, whoever he was, seemed to want nothing to do with being seen at all, and in a strange, unintended way. That same discretion may be exactly why history simply let him disappear. A crime built for spectacle gets remembered. A crime built for concealment, however brutal, however skilled, however patient, tends to fade, precisely because it worked exactly as its perpetrator intended. There's something worth sitting with in that idea, beyond just this one case. The killers we remember are so often not the most dangerous or the most prolific, but simply the ones who performed their violence in a way the public and the press couldn't look away from. In recent years, a small but growing group of historians and researchers has started pulling this case back out of the archive dust, cross-referencing old surgeons' reports with modern forensic understanding, and revisiting the original case files with a level of scrutiny Victorian investigators simply never had the tools for. None of it has produced a name. None of it has produced an arrest, obviously, more than a century after the fact. But it has produced something almost as valuable, a slowly building public record that at least acknowledges these women existed. That someone did this to them deliberately and repeatedly. And that the case was never actually solved, no matter how thoroughly it got overshadowed at the time. Somewhere in the fog of 1880s London, at least one man, quite possibly working entirely undetected alongside the most famous killer in criminal history, took women apart with a surgeon's precision, distributed the pieces of a puzzle he knew police would never fully solve, and walked away clean every single time, precisely because he never gave anyone a spectacle worth remembering. If this case pulled you in the way it pulled me in, tell me in the comments whether you think the Thames Torso Murders and Jack the Ripper were committed by the same man, or two killers working the same city at the same time entirely by coincidence. And if you want more real unsolved mysteries told exactly like this one, subscribe to Crime Through Time, because this channel exists for cases exactly like this one.